So research shows that selecting medical candidates with rather lower matric marks but who are more representative of race, culture and language is indeed working. The pass rate of medical students is far higher than for other courses and the dropout rate is lower. Let's get help in understanding this. We're joined by Jesse Copelyn from Bhekisisa Center for Health Journalism. Jesse, thank you very much for availing yourself. So some sectors of society believe that academic merit alone is what should get a student in medical school, but research titled How to Pick Good Doctors, Why Race, Language and Where People Come From Must Matter paints a completely different picture. Help us understand this.
Thanks so much for having me. So of course it's very important that students who go into medical school do meet certain academic thresholds, but academic marks definitely aren't everything. So, for instance, we know that students who do better at school will do better at medical school in general. When it comes to the actual part of medical school, the clinical component of medical school, where trainee doctors are evaluated on how well do they actually treat patients, there isn't a very strong relationship between how well they do in school and how well they'll do in those components. So, clearly students do need to meet certain academic thresholds. But the difference between a 95% doctor and a doctor who gets in with 95% and a doctor who gets in with 75%, it's not clear that those differences make a huge difference to how well they actually treat patients.
The research also shows that the race of a doctor in relation to their patients, the language they speak and where they grew up can influence the quality of care they provide. So does the race of the doctor actually matter? Is it as simple as that?
It definitely can matter. So, for instance, there was a study in the United States that found that black newborns, African-American newborns, had a lower chance of dying when the attending physician, when the doctor who was delivering that child was also black. And there are a couple of other studies like this coming out of the United States, recent studies that find that generally black patients do better when their doctors are also black. Of course, these things are trends, they're averages, they're not rules. And in the case of South Africa, we know that doctors who can only speak English or Afrikaans often struggle to treat patients who speak African languages and don't speak English or Afrikaans well. That often leads to communication problems between doctor and patient, and that can lead to serious medical error, as research reveals. So yes, race and language both can definitely matter.
Let's deal with the two examples that you have cited. With the case of the United States, why is it that when black people are treated by black people, they have higher chances of surviving? What is the underlying factor there?
So we don't know exactly. There are a few different hypotheses. There are a few different theories. One of the theories that was found in a recent study or evidence was found for this theory in a recent study, was that black doctors were basically communicating better with black patients. They were building partnerships with them, building relationships with them, and communication is, of course, very important for doctors to be able to treat patients well. There's a lot of conversation, a lot of talking that goes into that process. There's a trust-building process, and it seems as if black doctors were better able to cultivate that among black patients than white doctors were.
In the South African example that you cite, the research shows that even when it is black doctors that are attending to black patients, in particular in rural areas, you can have a language barrier which then impacts the way in which they're able to treat the patients. They cite the example of the Eastern Cape, for instance, where deep isiXhosa is spoken there and they're not able to understand. Essentially, what is then the impact?
Yeah, so there are a couple of studies, for instance, that found that patients who were communicated, there were Xhosa patients that were being treated by Xhosa nurses, but because those nurses were from Cape Town and because those patients were from rural Eastern Cape, the dialects were a bit different, and so the nurses said that they actually struggled to understand what the patients were saying. So just as there can be communication differences between people who speak different languages, there can also be communication difficulties that emerge with people who speak the same language but have different dialects. Someone comes from a very rural place and someone comes from a city. And so that kind of emphasizes the need to ensure that you also have more doctors and more nurses, more health practitioners who come from rural places so that they can best treat these patients.
Just finally for us, if we take this a few steps back, how this research was conducted.
So it depends on which research. In the case of the United States, that research is all sort of very quantitative research. So in that example I just mentioned of the newborns, what they did was they looked at nearly 2 million cases of hospital births. And they looked at, was there a relationship between the rates at which the newborn dies and the race of the attending physician. In the case of the South African research, it's mostly researchers going into hospitals and talking to nurses and doctors and patients and finding, actually a lot of black patients were really struggling in the hospital environment because they struggled to understand what doctors were saying when the doctor only spoke English and they struggled to speak English.